Tarragona, Spain, 2019. Carmen Saavedra held her breath as she watched her 4-year-old son Lucas draw with millimetric precision the floor plan of a house he had never been to, the family home where she grew up decades earlier, long before the child was born. "This was Carlos's room, right?" Lucas asked naturally, pointing to a room in his drawing that had indeed belonged to Carmen's twin brother, who died tragically at 16. He always kept his marbles in a metal box under the third loose floorboard, next to the window. Carmen's blood froze in her veins. That specific detail, the marbles hidden under that precise floorboard, was a secret shared only between her and her twin brother. Not even their parents knew about it. It was a hiding place Carlos had discovered when they were 8 years old, and that they used throughout their childhood to hide small treasures. How do you know that, Lucas?" Carmen managed to articulate in a shaky voice as a chill ran down her spine. The little boy looked up from his drawing and fixed his eyes on his mother's with a disturbing intensity, completely inappropriate for a child his age. A sad smile formed on his childish face. "Because I was Carlos," he replied with disconcerting serenity. "Before being your son, I was your brother." The room seemed to spin around Carmen. Her husband, Miguel, who had been observing the scene from the doorway, quickly approached to support her as she collapsed into the nearest chair. "I remember when Dad took us to La Pineda Beach and we buried that starfish we found," Lucas continued, unaware of the devastating impact of his words. "You were wearing a blue dress with white flowers, and I cut my foot on a stone. You cried more than I did." Miguel looked at his wife with an expression of growing alarm. Carmen had gone completely pale. That beach incident had happened 25 years ago, long before Miguel met Carmen, long before Lucas was even conceived. "Lucas, honey, who told you these things?" Miguel intervened, trying to stay calm. The child blinked, confused by the question. "Nobody told me," he responded simply. "I remember them." What began that afternoon as an innocent moment of drawing would become the beginning of a search that would challenge everything Carmen and Miguel believed about life, death, and the bonds that transcend both boundaries. If these reincarnation accounts also spark your curiosity, subscribe to follow each new case, and write in the comments from which country you're watching. I love discovering how far these stories reach. The days following Lucas's disturbing revelation were a whirlwind of contradictory emotions for Carmen and Miguel. Their first reaction, once the initial shock had passed, was to seek rational explanations. "He must have heard it in some family conversation," Miguel insisted as he prepared morning coffee, avoiding his wife's gaze. "Children absorb information like sponges, even when we think they're not paying attention." Carmen shook her head. "We never talked about the hidden marbles, Miguel. Not even with my parents. It was an exclusive secret between Carlos and me." Determined to find a logical explanation, they discreetly questioned grandparents, uncles, and close friends. No one remembered ever mentioning those specific details in front of the child. The exact description of the old family house, the secret hiding place, the beach incident, all were intimate memories that had never been part of the usual family anecdotes. As a last resort, they consulted with the school child psychologist, Dr. Martinez, who suggested that Lucas might be developing an elaborate fantasy to connect with the family history. "It's common in intelligent children to create complex narratives," the professional explained. "He has possibly picked up fragments of conversations and constructed this story as a way to process the absence of the uncle he never knew." Carmen wanted to believe it. She needed to believe it. But that very night, as she tucked Lucas in for bed, the boy looked at her with those eyes, Carlos's eyes, she realized now, and whispered, "Do you remember the promise I made to you the day I died, Carmencita?" Only Carlos called her that, Carmencita. And only the two of them knew about the promise made in that hospital, when cancer was finally winning the battle. "I promised you I would find a way to come back, that I wouldn't leave you alone, and I kept it." Carmen rushed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. In the hallway she slid to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. "What's happening?" Miguel asked, alarmed by his wife's state. "The promise," Carmen murmured through tears. "Lucas knows about the promise Carlos made to me before he died. No one else was in the room when it happened. No one else knows." And so, as night fell over Tarragona, Carmen began to face a possibility that defied everything she believed about reality, that her twin brother's soul had found its way back to her, this time as her own son. The impossibility of finding a rational explanation led Carmen to seek answers beyond the confines of conventional science. After weeks of internet research, she found Dr. Joaquin Fernandez, director of the Research Center for Expanded Consciousness Phenomena, CIFCE, in Barcelona, one of the few Spanish scientists dedicated to the rigorous study of cases of apparent reincarnation. A month after the first incidents, Dr. Fernandez arrived at the Saavedra home with his research team. At 60 years old, with his silver hair and thin-framed glasses, he projected an image of academic seriousness that contrasted with the controversial nature of his work. "I'm not here to convince you that reincarnation exists," he clarified as he set up his recording equipment in the living room. "My goal is to document with scientific rigor phenomena that traditional science has ignored due to methodological prejudices." Carmen nodded, appreciating the objective approach. Miguel, for his part, maintained a cautious skepticism that the researcher seemed to value. "Skepticism is essential in this field," Fernandez commented to Miguel. "It prevents us from rushing toward extraordinary conclusions without first exhausting conventional explanations." The first interview with Lucas took place in a relaxed atmosphere. The child was playing with building blocks, while Dr. Fernandez casually conversed with him. "Lucas, your mum has told me that you know many things about her brother Carlos," the researcher began. The boy looked up, evaluating the stranger with a surprisingly penetrating gaze. "I don't know things about him," he finally responded. "I was him." "Could you tell me how that's possible?" Fernandez asked, maintaining a neutral tone. Lucas shrugged with the carelessness typical of childhood. "I don't know how to explain it. I just know that I was very sick, then everything turned dark, and then I woke up being small again, with Carmen as my mom." The naturalness with which the child described this impossible process left everyone silent. Fernandez took meticulous notes, his expression inscrutable. "Do you remember specific things from when you were Carlos?" the researcher continued. What followed was a cascade of precise memories, dates, names, and events that a 4-year-old child could not have fabricated. The tension in the room grew with each revelation, but it was the mention of a particular detail that made Dr. Fernandez look up from his notes with renewed interest. "The birthmark," Lucas said, pointing behind his right ear. "I had a crescent-shaped birthmark exactly here when I was Carlos. Is it still there?" The researcher looked at Carmen, who nodded slowly, wide-eyed. None of them had noticed that Lucas had a birthmark in that exact location. "I need to verify something," said Dr. Fernandez in a controlled but tense voice. He took a small magnifying glass from his briefcase and approached Lucas, who remained surprisingly calm. With precise movements, the researcher examined behind the child's right ear, carefully moving aside the hair. Carmen and Miguel held their breath, instinctively leaning forward. "Indeed," Fernandez murmured after several seconds. "There is a small birthmark here, practically invisible to the naked eye due to its location and the hair." Carmen approached, trembling to look. There it was, a small crescent-shaped mark, exactly like the one Carlos had had in the same place. A mark she had forgotten until Lucas mentioned it, and that the child could not have seen on himself without the help of a mirror and deliberate attention he had never shown toward that specific part of his anatomy. "Did Carlos have a similar birthmark?" Fernandez asked Carmen, although his expression already anticipated the answer. "Identical," she confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. "In the exact same place. The correspondence of birthmarks with wounds or distinctive characteristics of the supposed past life is one of the most significant patterns in cases of apparent reincarnation," explained Fernandez. "But we need more evidence before reaching any conclusions." The researcher then took out a series of photographs, mixing images of unknown people with some of Carmen's family, including one of Carlos taken shortly before his illness. All were arranged so that Lucas could not receive clues from the adults' reactions. "Do you recognize anyone here?" Fernandez asked, spreading the photographs in front of the child. Without hesitation, Lucas pointed directly at Carlos's photo. "This is me, before." He then correctly identified the grandparents when they were much younger, an uncle who had died before Lucas was born, and even pointed to teenage Carmen, saying, "Here you are the day we went to the fair and you got scared on the roller coaster. I bought you cotton candy to stop you from crying." Carmen put her hand to her mouth. That day had never been photographically documented. It was simply a 14-year-old Carmen and Carlos at the entrance to an amusement park, smiling at the camera. Nothing in the image suggested the episode of fear or the cotton candy. Dr. Fernandez observed with clinical attention, but even his professional impartiality showed cracks in the face of the impossible precision of Lucas's identifications and memories. There's something else I need to verify, the researcher finally said, closing his notebook. Something that could provide the definitive evidence for this extraordinary case. The following morning dawned with a clarity that contrasted with the emotional confusion reigning in the Saavedra house. Dr. Fernandez had returned, this time accompanied by a young assistant who was carrying digital scanning equipment and an old worn cardboard box that Carmen immediately recognized. "These are Carlos's belongings," she murmured with a lump in her throat as the researcher placed the box on the dining room table. "My mother kept them after his death. I gave them to Dr. Fernandez last night, after Lucas went to sleep." Miguel nodded silently, his initial skepticism gradually transforming into a disturbing openness to the inexplicable. During the night, he had been reviewing videos of Lucas's early childhood, looking for any moment when the child might have been exposed to information about Carlos. He found nothing. "What I propose," Fernandez explained as he prepared a small experiment, "is a controlled recognition test. The box contains personal objects of Carlos that Lucas has never seen. Among them, I have mixed similar objects that did not belong to Carlos." Carmen immediately understood the methodology. If Lucas really harbored Carlos's memories, he should be able to distinguish the authentic objects. When the child entered the room, rubbing his eyes with sleep, the researcher smiled affably at him. "Good morning, Lucas. Would you like to play a little game with me?" The child nodded, his childish curiosity quickly awakening. Dr. Fernandez began to extract objects from the box, placing them in pairs on the table. 2 similar wristwatches, 2 soccer team shirts of the same color, 2 almost identical school notebooks. "Can you tell me which of these objects seem familiar to you, as if they had been yours before?" The tension in the room was palpable as Lucas examined the objects. Without hesitation, he pointed to one of the watches. "This was mine. It stopped the day I fell off my bicycle in front of the institute." Carmen stifled a sob. That was exactly what had happened with Carlos's watch. One after another, Lucas correctly identified each object that had belonged to his uncle. But the true revelation came when Dr. Fernandez extracted the last pair of objects. 2 apparently identical small metal boxes. "This one," Lucas said without hesitation, pointing to one of them. "This is where I kept my special marbles." The researcher nodded, maintaining an increasingly difficult scientific neutrality. "Can you open it?" When Lucas lifted the lid, everyone could see the empty interior of the box. The child frowned. "My marbles are missing, and also my lucky charm." "What lucky charm?" Fernandez asked, exchanging a significant look with Carmen, who slightly shook her head, indicating she didn't know what the child was referring to. "My lucky charm," Lucas explained impatiently, "a small stone with a fossil inside. I found it the summer before I got sick. I always kept it in this box under the marbles." Dr. Fernandez took a deep breath. "Lucas, is there any way to verify that this stone existed? Did anyone else see it?" The child thought for a moment, and then smiled. "Of course. I photographed it, with the camera they gave me for my birthday. I took photos of all my collections." The researcher looked at Carmen, who was completely pale. "The camera and the negatives," she whispered. "They're in my parents' attic. We never developed them after his death." Carmen's family home on the outskirts of Tarragona remained practically intact since Carlos's death, preserved almost as a sanctuary by her parents. The visit that same afternoon was emotionally overwhelming for everyone. For Carmen, it meant facing painfully preserved memories. For Miguel, it was entering a past he only knew through fragmented accounts. For Lucas, according to his own words, it was coming back home. The attic, a space under the roof filled with dusty boxes and family mementos, received the small group with the characteristic smell of places closed for a long time. Carmen turned on the light, revealing a labyrinth of carefully labeled objects. "Carlos's things are at the back," she explained, her voice breaking slightly. "My parents kept everything. They couldn't get rid of anything." Lucas, who had remained unusually quiet during the car ride, took a few steps forward, looking around with a strange expression on his childish face, as if he recognized the place, but found it simultaneously familiar and alien. "The box with the camera is there," he suddenly said, pointing to a specific corner, hidden behind an old wardrobe. "Behind the furniture. I put it there so nobody would find it." Carmen exchanged a look with Dr. Fernandez, who nodded discreetly. Miguel, following the directions, moved the heavy piece of furniture, indeed revealing a cardboard box that had remained invisible from that corner. With trembling hands, Carmen opened it. Inside rested an old Kodak analog camera and several undeveloped film rolls exactly where Lucas had indicated they would be. These were my last photos, Lucas explained with a disturbing simplicity. I took them shortly before going to the hospital, when I already knew I was very sick. Dr. Fernandez carefully extracted one of the rolls. We need to develop this as soon as possible. 3 hours later, in a photographic laboratory in downtown Tarragona, the technician handed over an envelope with the newly developed photographs. The atmosphere in the small waiting room was so dense it seemed difficult to breathe. Fernandez opened the envelope with meticulous precision and extracted the images. Photographs taken by a teenager more than 22 years ago, never before seen by anyone. The first ones showed landscapes, some pets, everyday moments captured by a young man who knew his time was running out. And then it appeared, the photograph of a small collection of objects carefully arranged on a dark cloth. Colored marbles, some stamps, foreign coins, and in the center, clearly visible, a small grayish stone with a tiny embedded fossil. "My lucky charm," Lucas whispered, touching the image with the tip of his index finger. "I found it on La Mora Beach. I said it would bring me luck." Then he added with a sadness improper for his age, "I guess it didn't work." The silence that followed was broken only by the muffled sound of Carmen's crying. The evidence was undeniable. Lucas had correctly identified the existence and location of an object that no one had ever seen, photographed on a roll never developed, hidden in a place that only Carlos knew about. Dr. Fernandez looked at Miguel, whose face reflected a mixture of shock and incredulity, surrendered to the evidence. "This," said the researcher gravely, "goes beyond any conventional explanation." The discovery of the Lucky Charm photograph acted as a catalyst, triggering an avalanche of increasingly specific memories in Lucas. As they toured the old family house, the child identified objects and narrated events with a precision that was impossible to explain by conventional means. "I kept my comic books in this drawer," he said, directly opening a hidden compartment in the base of the desk, a secret mechanism that not even Carmen remembered. "The ones Mom wouldn't let me read because she said they were too violent." Lucas's grandmother, Carmen and Carlos's mother, had been summoned to witness the investigation. She remained silent, observing with a mixture of astonishment and reverential fear as her grandson navigated the room that had belonged to her deceased son, revealing secrets and recalling anecdotes that only Carlos could know. "Remember when I broke your favorite vase, Mom?" Lucas asked the elderly woman, using the term Mom to address his grandmother, a linguistic slip that became increasingly frequent when he spoke about his memories as Carlos. "I glued it and placed it so that the crack wouldn't show. You never knew." The woman put her hand to her chest, visibly affected. "The blue porcelain vase. One day I found it broken in the wardrobe. I never knew how it happened, Doctor." Fernandez meticulously documented each revelation, but the case took an even more extraordinary turn when Lucas began to talk about events that occurred after Carlos's death. "I was there when you were born," he suddenly said to Miguel, his current father, during a pause in the exploration. "I saw you before becoming your son." An absolute silence fell over the room. Even Dr. Fernandez, accustomed to disconcerting testimonies, seemed momentarily perplexed. "What do you mean, Lucas?" the researcher finally asked. The child shrugged as if explaining something perfectly ordinary. "After dying, I didn't leave immediately. I stayed floating near Carmen. I saw her cry at my funeral. I saw her meet Miguel at the university. I was present at their wedding." He turned to his father with a smile. "I knew you were the right person for her. That's why I chose you as my dad." Miguel, completely pale, collapsed into a nearby chair. "This is impossible." "And yet," Dr. Fernandez intervened in a quiet voice, "Lucas has just described what some spiritual traditions call the intermediate state, or bardo, a period of disembodied consciousness between death and rebirth." The researcher leaned toward Lucas. "Do you remember how you decided to be reborn as Carmen and Miguel's son?" The child's answer would open a new dimension in this already extraordinary case, entering territories that not even the experienced researcher had explored before. "I saw a light," Lucas replied, his gaze momentarily lost in the memory. "But I didn't want to go towards it. I had promised Carmen that I would find a way to come back, so I stayed." Dr. Fernandez nodded, maintaining a neutral expression that barely concealed his scientific fascination. "And then what happened?" "I waited," the child continued. "I saw Carmen continue with her life. I saw her meet Miguel at the university library. I saw when they fell in love. And one day, I knew it was time." Lucas paused, as if searching for the right words to describe an experience that transcended human language. I felt a kind of call, and I knew Carmen was going to have a baby, her baby, and then I decided that baby would be me. The simplicity with which the child described the most mysterious process of human existence dramatically contrasted with the metaphysical depth of his words. Carmen, silent tears running down her cheeks, perfectly remembered the moment she knew she was pregnant, a vivid dream with her brother Carlos the night before the pregnancy test. "There's something else," Lucas suddenly added, looking directly at Dr. Fernandez. "Something that will prove to you that all of this is true." The researcher leaned forward, his scientific skepticism fighting against the growing evidence of the inexplicable. "What is it, Lucas?" "The letter," the child responded. "The letter I wrote for Carmen before I died. They never gave it to her." Carmen held her breath. "What letter, Lucas? Carlos didn't leave any letter." "Yes, I did," the little boy insisted with a disconcerting certainty. "I wrote it the night before going into a coma. I hid it inside my copy of The Little Prince because I knew you would keep it." A collective shiver ran through the room. The mentioned book was indeed Carlos's favorite, and Carmen had preserved it as one of her most precious treasures. "It's in your house," Lucas continued, "on the living room bookshelf, on the page where the little prince talks to the fox about what is invisible and essential." Miguel offered to go immediately to get the book. Dr. Fernandez, visibly impressed by the specificity of the testimony, decided that this verification should be done under controlled conditions. "I'll call my assistant to pick up the book following Lucas's directions exactly," he explained. "This way we'll eliminate any possibility of suggestion or coincidence." 2 hours later, the assistant returned with the thin volume. Following the protocol established by Fernandez, the book was opened before witnesses, including 2 notaries urgently summoned to document the process. And there, exactly on the page indicated by Lucas, carefully folded and preserved for more than 2 decades, appeared a handwritten sheet of paper that Carmen had never seen. With trembling hands, Dr. Fernandez unfolded the letter and began to read aloud the words written by a dying teenager 22 years ago. "Dear Carmencita, when you read this, I will no longer be here, but I promised you that I would find a way to come back to you, and I will. I don't know how or when, but you will recognize my soul when it returns." The proof was irrefutable, a letter hidden for 2 decades in a place that only Carlos knew about, with content that exactly anticipated what was now happening. The discovery of the letter shocked even Dr. Fernandez's scientific team. During the following days, the investigation intensified with additional interviews, psychological tests, and comparative analyses between Lucas and the available documentation about Carlos. A week later, the researcher presented his preliminary conclusions to a small group that included Carmen, Miguel, Lucas's grandparents, and 2 colleagues specializing in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. "What we are witnessing," Fernandez explained, projecting graphs and statistics on his laptop screen, "is what we call a Class A case of past life memory. The accumulated evidence transcends any conventional explanation." The scientist deployed a rigorous methodology for his analysis. "We have documented 49 specific and verifiable memories that Lucas has provided about Carlos's life. Of these, 37 were never mentioned in the child's presence. 12 involve information that only Carlos knew, and 8 include data that we could verify independently, but that not even Carmen remembered." The statistical precision dramatically contrasted with the metaphysical nature of the phenomenon he was trying to describe. Dr. Rodriguez, a skeptical neuroscientist, specially invited to offer a critical perspective, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Couldn't we be dealing with an extremely sophisticated case of childhood cryptomnesia? A subconscious absorption of fragmentary information that the child then organizes coherently?" Fernandez nodded, valuing the objection. "That's the hypothesis we first considered. However, the letter hidden in the book completely dismantles it. Lucas not only knew of its existence, but its exact content and specific location in a book he had never touched. This transcends any explanation based on unconscious information transfer." "So are we talking about reincarnation?" asked Miguel, pronouncing for the first time the word everyone had been avoiding. "In scientific terms," Fernandez responded carefully, "we are dealing with a phenomenon of consciousness continuity that suggests the persistence of certain mental and informational patterns beyond biological death." The researcher then projected comparative images. Carlos's birthmark behind the ear, and the identical one on Lucas, certain facial features surprisingly similar despite the absence of a direct genetic link, and even graphological analyses showing common patterns between Lucas's early writing and Carlos's. From a purely materialistic perspective, he continued, consciousness is considered an emergent epiphenomenon of neural activity which definitively ceases with brain death. However, cases like Lucas Carlos force us to consider alternative models. Dr. Fernandez deployed a new graph representing what he called the non-local consciousness model. The hypothesis that best explains the observed data suggests that consciousness, or at least certain informational aspects of it, might not be completely localized in the physical brain, but interacts with it. Under certain circumstances, these informational patterns could persist and eventually link to a new neurobiological substrate. Dr. Martinez, a neuropsychologist present at the meeting, intervened with professional skepticism. What you're proposing challenges our entire current understanding of the mind-brain relationship. What physical mechanism would allow such a transfer? That is precisely the limit of our current knowledge, Fernandez acknowledged. I don't claim to explain the how, but to document the what. And what we are documenting is a case where the informational continuity between two consciousnesses separated by physical death is impossible to explain through conventional models. Carmen, who had remained silent during the presentation, finally spoke with a broken but firm voice. For me, the scientific explanation is secondary. What I know is that my brother found a way to fulfill his promise. And that is all I need to understand. Her simple statement, deeply human amid that scientific analysis, reminded everyone present that beyond the extraordinary phenomenon they were studying, they were dealing with a fundamentally emotional story, that of a fraternal love that had found a way to transcend even the final barrier of death. The months following the revelations profoundly transformed the Saavedra family's life. The documentation of the case by Dr. Fernandez, initially published in a discreet scientific journal, gradually attracted the attention of researchers worldwide specializing in unconventional consciousness phenomena. For Carmen, the process was simultaneously healing and challenging. It's as if I've recovered my brother and gained a son at the same time, she confessed during one of the follow-up sessions. Some days I clearly see Carlos in Lucas, in his gestures, in the way he laughs. Other days, I perceive the differences, the new person emerging with his own unique identity. Miguel, initially the most skeptical, perhaps experienced the most profound transformation. I've had to reconsider everything I believed about life and death, he explained. Now I see my son as a continuation of something much greater than ourselves, not just as a new beginning. The case triggered practical changes in the family dynamics. The maternal grandparents, who had maintained a certain emotional distance from Lucas, perhaps unconsciously sensing the disturbing connection with their deceased son, now forged a much deeper bond with him. It's as if they've recovered a part of Carlos, Carmen observed, but they're also learning to love Lucas for who he is now, not just for who he was. From the scientific perspective, Dr. Fernandez established a longitudinal follow-up protocol. The fascinating thing in these cases, he explained during a conference in Barcelona, is the pattern of gradual fading of memories from the previous life as the development of the new identity progresses. Indeed, as Lucas turned 5, he began to refer to his memories as Carlos in the third person, no longer as his own experiences, but as stories he knew. The transition was subtle but significant. The child was developing his own separate identity, integrating but not being trapped in the memories of his previous life. For the broader scientific community, the Lucas Carlos case became a reference point that forced a reconsideration of established paradigms about human consciousness. The prestigious Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in Madrid initiated a specific program to study similar phenomena, recognizing that well-documented exceptions to materialist models deserved serious investigation rather than automatic dismissal. We are not claiming that reincarnation exists as described by religious traditions, clarified Dr. Fernandez in a television interview that generated considerable controversy. We are documenting observable phenomena that suggest our current understanding of consciousness is, at the very least, incomplete. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the relationship between Carmen and Lucas. One afternoon, while they were reviewing old photo albums together, the child looked at his mother with an expression that combined childish innocence with wisdom impossible for his years. "Do you know what's the best thing about having come back, Mom?" he asked, using for the first time in weeks the term Mom instead of Carmencita to address her. "That now I can love you in two different ways. As your brother who always took care of you, and as your son whom you now take care of." That simple observation crystallized the extraordinary nature of their bond, a relationship that transcended conventional categories, creating something new and deeply healing for both. And as the family learned to navigate this unprecedented reality, the case opened the door to a more expansive understanding of human bonds, suggesting that perhaps, in certain exceptional cases, love could find ways to transcend even the final barrier of death. Lucas's 6th birthday coincided with the anniversary of Carlos's death, a synchronicity that didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the family. Carmen had planned a small celebration in the garden, trying to keep the date focused on Lucas and not on the painful memory that had always overshadowed that day. The morning began with a surprisingly clear sky for late September. Lucas, excited about his gifts and the anticipation of the party, radiated the pure and uncontaminated joy of childhood. For Carmen, observing him was a bittersweet experience. She saw less and less of Carlos in him and more of Lucas, the unique and wonderful child who was developing his own identity. In the mid-afternoon, while the invited children played in the garden under Miguel's supervision, Lucas unexpectedly approached Carmen, who was arranging appetizers in the kitchen. "I need to show you something," he said with a sudden seriousness that contrasted with the exuberance of moments before. Before the grandparents arrived, he took his mother's hand and led her to his room. Once there, he pulled out from under the bed a small box that Carmen had never seen before. "I've been saving it for today," he explained as he opened it carefully. Inside rested an object that Carmen immediately recognized, the small stone with the fossil, Carlos's lucky charm that they had seen in the photograph revealed months earlier. "Where?" Carmen began, but her voice broke before she could complete the question. "I found it in the grandparents' attic the day we went with Dr. Fernandez," Lucas explained. "It was in the camera box, wrapped in a handkerchief. Nobody saw it, but I knew it was there." Carmen took the small stone with trembling hands, a tangible object that had traveled from Carlos's hands to Lucas's, establishing a physical bridge between both existences. "Why didn't you show it then?" she asked softly. Lucas looked toward the window, his expression oscillating between childish innocence and something much older and deeper. "Because it was only for you," he finally responded, "not for scientists or tests." There was a silence loaded with meaning, broken only by the distant sound of children playing in the garden. "There's something else I need to tell you," Lucas continued, his voice acquiring a nuance that Carmen immediately recognized, the same tone Carlos used when he needed to share something important. "I think this is the last time I'll be able to talk to you as him." Carmen felt her heart momentarily stop. "What do you mean?" "The memories are fading more and more each day," Lucas explained with a disturbing clarity. "Soon, they'll be just like distant dreams. Dr. Fernandez says it's normal, that it's part of the process." He approached his mother and took her hands in his, a surprisingly mature gesture for a 6-year-old child. "I want you to know that I kept my promise. I came back to you. I saw you overcome the pain, find love, build a beautiful life, and now I can be part of it in a new way." Silent tears ran down Carmen's cheeks as she listened to these words that were simultaneously a farewell and a new beginning. "Carlos will always be part of who I am," Lucas continued, "but now I need to be mainly Lucas. Your son, not your brother. Do you understand?" Carmen nodded, unable to speak. She understood perfectly. She was witnessing the final transition, the moment when Carlos's consciousness fully integrated into Lucas's new identity, allowing him to develop fully as his own being. "I love you, Carmencita," Lucas said, using for the last time the affectionate nickname that Carlos had always employed. Then, as if an invisible veil had fallen, his expression subtly changed, becoming entirely childlike again. "Can we keep the lucky charm in my new treasure collection, Mom?" Carmen, containing a sob, hugged her son tightly. "Of course, my love. It's yours now." At that precise moment, the doorbell announced the arrival of the grandparents. Lucas smiled broadly, the excitement of his birthday regaining prominence. He ran to the door, leaving Carmen alone for a moment with the small stone in her hand, and the certainty of having witnessed something deeply sacred, not only the continuity of the soul, but also its capacity for transformation and renewal. 5 years after that transcendental afternoon, The Lucas Carlos case had evolved in directions that no one could have foreseen. Dr. Fernandez, now director of the recently inaugurated European Institute for Consciousness Research, published his definitive monograph, Continuity and Transformation: The Lucas Carlos Case and Its Implications for a New Science of Human Consciousness. The work, supported by a decade of rigorous research, became a mandatory reference in universities around the world, establishing new paradigms for the scientific study of phenomena that had previously been relegated exclusively to the realm of religious beliefs. The truly revolutionary aspect of the case, Fernandez wrote in his conclusions, is not simply that it documents the possible continuity of consciousness beyond biological death, but that it allows us to observe the gradual integration of two apparently distinct identities into a new, unique synthesis. Lucas, now 11 years old, had developed a vibrant and distinctively personal personality. As he had predicted years before, his memories as Carlos had transformed into diffuse impressions, similar to distant dreams. However, certain patterns persisted: an extraordinary musical ability that had never been formally cultivated, a special intuition for understanding others' suffering,